In this video, we'll consider some general themes in the Fathers of the Church regarding the Eucharist. And in particular, we'll look at the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist. Now, these are two themes that our author Feingold brought out in detail in the chapter you read. And so these videos are not going to go through every single author. That's why you read the book. Hopefully you noticed that there's a certain consensus among the fathers about these two things. A realism about Christ's presence in the Eucharist, and a certain unanimity or consensus that the Eucharist has a sacrificial nature. We'll look at this in a few different ways here. First of all, let's talk about just some general characteristics of Eucharistic theology in the patristic period. This image, by the way, is from one of the catacombs in Rome, and it's one of the earliest depictions of the Last Supper. So what can we say about some general themes about the Eucharist in the early church? Well, this period of the Fathers, as I mentioned, is the first period of the development of doctrine. So it's a period of gradual synthesis and systematization. So revelation is being meditated upon, and it's being put together in a synthesis. It's being ordered into a system. And so that's going to foster, it's going to promote this development. In this early period, there's an initial lack of technical language to speak about the Eucharist. Again, you don't have language such as transubstantiation or substance and accidents that will come up in the medieval period. You do find some language about a substantial change in some of the Greek writers. But overall, the language is biblical and phenomenological. That is, it deals with appearances. This is important. There's few, if any, Eucharistic controversies. No one is questioning the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. No one is challenging this. And often you find the greatest development in doctrine and the greatest precision in language when a doctrine is challenged. But we don't have this challenge in this period. There are no Eucharistic controversies in the church really until the 9th century. And again, that's a time when you see great development of doctrine. And so, in a sense, that allows the early church to have this initial lack of technical language, because they don't need it yet to address a controversy. And there's little reflection on the how of the Eucharistic conversion. There's a great consensus, there's a great agreement that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, that the Eucharist is the Christian sacrifice. But there's little question of how that occurs. That comes later in the medieval period. The early church fathers are asking different kinds of questions. They're not yet asking for the how. So you'll see, by the way, with few Eucharistic controversies and little reflection on the how of the Eucharistic conversion, they're simply asking different questions than later theology will. And development of doctrine is guided by the kinds of questions that are being asked. There's a witness to early liturgical practice and its initial development. So one of the things we do have are some, not many, but some early documents on liturgical practice. And we'll look at some of those in some of our videos coming up. Now, let's focus on these two things, the real presence and the sacrifice of the Eucharist. Starting with the real presence. we can say, first of all, in the period before the First Council of Nicaea in 325, that's one very convenient point to make to categorize, to make it to draw a line. We could draw a line elsewhere. That's a very convenient place to do so. So if we look at the period before the Council of Nicaea in 325, we encounter really three kinds of language for what's given in the Eucharist. First, we find a relatively vague language in the Fathers, which speaks in rather general terms of the Eucharist as a spiritual gift. So a rather just general kind of language. What is the Eucharist? It's this spiritual gift of God. Second, we find statements in some of the early church fathers to the effect that the Eucharistic bread and wine are the symbolon in Greek, or symbol, or figura, figure, of Christ's body and blood. Now, we should pause there and say, that's interesting, because we've seen already in the New Testament and in this chapter from Feingold that the language around the Eucharist has a certain realism. We might say, but wait, it's not a symbol or a figure. It is Christ's body and blood. And so we need to understand that symbol in ancient times, at the time of the early church fathers, has a very different connotation or meaning than it does today. Symbol in the ancient world meant a thing which in some way really is what it signified. It really is what it signified. Right? For us, perhaps a symbol is just a mere sign, an empty sign. It's a sign of something absent. But that's not what the early church fathers meant when they spoke of symbol. They meant something, a thing which in some way really is what it signified. A symbol means the manifestation of a reality in a fresh way. And so in that sense, the Eucharist is a symbol. It is Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity present, but in a new way. It's under the appearance of bread and wine. Figure is the same, it's the same way with figure. We have a different meaning today. Figure in the ancient world signified the distinctiveness of a reality, what it alone, what it is in itself, and only that thing. Let's see. So, when Philippians 2 was translated into Latin, and it says that Christ was in the form of God, it uses the word figura. He was in the figure of God. That in no way denies that he really was God. On the contrary, Christ had the distinctiveness of that reality. So all this is to say, the early church fathers used this language of symbol or figure, but that does not mean they're denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And in fact, today, in the 20th century, some Catholic theologians have tried to make use again of the term symbol to bring us back to that patristic notion of symbol, to give us a theology of symbols. So one theologian in particular who's done this is Karl Rahner, who's written a whole theology of the symbol. And then finally, that dot should be the number 3. 1, 2, and 3, you also find in the early church very strong realist language, that this is the body and blood of Christ. And you saw this in writers like Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon. Other examples would be Cyril of Jerusalem or St. John Chrysostom. This very clear language about the reality of Christ's body and blood. In the period after Nicaea, we find an increasing predominance of the realist language over the indefinite or symbolist accounts. So after Nicaea, you see more and more of number 3 and less of number 2. And nevertheless, some symbolist terminology does continue, and now we see language of signum in the West. You find that with St. Augustine, a sign, and image or antitype in the East. But again, this language of sign, image, antitype, none of that was ever used to deny the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And in fact, where we find these fathers using this language, the same fathers use the very realist terminology as well. There are also, in the patristic period, there are also the beginnings of a theological attempt to explore the relationship between the material elements and Jesus Christ in his divine and human reality. So the question becomes, what's the relationship between the bread and wine and Christ? And so there are, in the early church, really 2 schools of thought. There are those who stress the abiding reality of bread and wine. If you've done Christology, this terminology will be familiar. There's the Antiochenes and the Alexandrians. The Antiochenes are those fathers from the theological center of Antioch, and the Alexandrians from the theological center of Alexandria in Egypt. And they had competing Christologies in the early church. They were really very complementary, actually. But they also stressed different aspects of the Eucharistic mystery. So these fathers in the school of Antioch stressed the abiding reality of bread and wine, such that the bread of the Eucharist would remain bread after the consecration, just as the embodied humanity taken by the Word remains a human body throughout his incarnate life. So there's an argument about the Eucharist taken from Christology. And these fathers of the school of Antioch wanted to stress that the second person of the Trinity, once he takes on a human body, remains a human body. And so in order to stress that, they argued that point similarly with the Eucharist, that the Eucharist, after consecration, remains bread as well. And then on the other hand, there are those who affirm the change in the elements, and these would be more typically the Alexandrians. So these fathers minimize the continuance of the elements of bread and wine after the consecration. They don't speak of the bread and wine after the consecration. And they approximate some form of the doctrine later known as transubstantiation. So again, these fathers would be fathers like Cyril of Jerusalem, Gregory of Nyssa, St. John Chrysostom. Over time, these are the fathers whose language becomes predominant, becomes the language of the wider church. Now let's look at the sacrificial character of the Eucharist. The fathers before Nicaea, we call them the ante-Nicean fathers before Nicaea, they're marked first of all by a repudiation or a denial of carnal sacrifice. So all of the early church fathers wanted to deny the necessity for animal sacrifice. That was clear. The sacrificial system of Israel had come to an end. But then, what had taken the place? What had taken the place of the sacrifices of the Old Testament? The most obvious answer to that question is the totality of Christian faith, life, and worship. We offer ourselves as spiritual sacrifice. You can look at Romans 12:2 as an example of this, where Paul tells us to offer our bodies as our spiritual sacrifice. However, if the whole of Christian life is a sacrifice in God's honor, then the Eucharist, as the center of that life, must be the sacrifice par excellence. This idea is encouraged by a reference to Malachi 1:11. And we looked last time when we discussed, or 2 classes ago, when we discussed the Old Testament, we looked at Malachi 1:11, this prophecy that there would be from the rising of the sun to its setting a pure sacrifice amongst the nations. And so the early church fathers, as I pointed out in that lecture, often referred to Malachi 1:11 to explain the Eucharist as a sacrifice. And this basic idea you find throughout the fathers, and you saw that, I hope, when you read Feingold. So I showed this in the other lecture, but Justin Martyr, and the Didache refer to the Eucharist as thousia in Greek, a sacrifice, or even as the sacrifice of Christians. Irenaeus calls the Eucharist the pure sacrifice, or the new oblation of the new covenant. Well, if that's the case, if all of Christian life is a sacrifice to God, but the Eucharist is the sacrifice par excellence, then how is the Eucharistic sacrifice distinctive? What's unique about the Eucharist as a sacrifice? Well, first, some fathers link the Eucharist in a special way with the sacrifice of the cross. That what is sacrificed in the Eucharist is identified. It's the same in some way with who is sacrificed on the cross. Other fathers associate the Eucharistic sacrifice not with the cross, but with the intercession of the risen and glorified Christ. So Christ in heaven right now, a kind of heavenly sacrifice in which the earthly sacramental act of the Eucharist participates. So you can see there's 2 different ways the fathers looked at this. One, the Eucharist is a participation or a representation of the sacrifice of the cross. Or in another way, it's a participation in Christ's self-offering now in heaven. In the post-Nicene age, after Nicaea, sacrificial language for the Eucharist becomes even stronger, becomes more insistent. And it's Augustine who offers really the first theology, the first reflective, systematic theology of the Eucharist as sacrifice. And so we can look at some of his points. Augustine is able to explain how the primary sacrifice of Calvary, the cross, is related to the secondary sacrifice of the church, that is the Eucharist. First, the church's sacrifice is the sacramental symbolization of the sacrifice of Christ. That's how the 2 are related. The Eucharistic sacrifice is done under the signs of bread and wine. It's a sacramental symbolization of the sacrifice of Christ. Christ founded the Eucharist as a sacramental sign of his own sacrifice. And remember, we saw in the institution narratives in the New Testament that the language of the Last Supper is sacrificial. So Christ founded the Eucharist as a sacramental sign of his own sacrifice, so that the church, in offering bread and wine, offers not only herself, but Christ as well. So because the Eucharist is the sacramental symbolization of the sacrifice of Christ, in offering the Eucharist, the church is offering Christ himself. Second, by celebrating this sacramental symbol, the church learns how to insert her own self-offering into that of Christ's. So we move from offering Christ and his self-offering to now offering ourselves in union with that. So Augustine brings together the idea that the church offers herself in the Eucharist with the notion that she offers Christ in the Eucharist. Hence, the church learns how to integrate her own self-offering into Christ's. So what occurs at Mass? I offer my own sacrifices. All the good I have done, all the evil I have endured, I offer that in union with Christ's sacrifice. So again, the church learns how to integrate her self-offering into Christ's, just as Christ's human offering was integrated into the divine self-offering of the Word. There's a beautiful parallel there. As the human nature of Christ was, as Christ's offering in his human nature, was integrated into the self-offering of the Word, the second person of the Trinity, so in a similar way, our self-offering is integrated into Christ's self-offering through the Eucharist. Now, in our next few videos, we'll look at 4 of the earliest documents that speak of the Eucharist and ask, what did they teach us about the Eucharist in the early church?